Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage, and we're back for another edition of Thyroid Answers podcast. Dr. Erica couldn't be with us today, but I brought a guest in instead, and I have Dr. Cynthia Thurlow, and she is a nurse practitioner, and we are going to talk about intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating. She is a nutrition expert. She's been on TEDx 2 times, I believe, right? And I think it's one of the first places I saw your information was a TEDx talk that you did, and I was like, wonder where that person's from. And then I, I think we follow each other, and so you have a spunky commentary on a lot of different things. I think you get some information out there. So hey, thanks for coming on to the podcast and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. And yes, I would definitely say I can be a little feisty, and I grew up in New Jersey. So I always like to say that's my nod to my New Jersey roots. I don't have any qualms, although I won't do it on the podcast. I can drop an F-bomb like the best of them. So
your background, you were a nurse practitioner, right? Now you're into this functional medicine space. So give the listeners a little bit of background about your journey. How did you go from like traditional medical care to functional medicine?
Great question. So I started in ER medicine and later transitioned to cardiology. So I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. And I did that for a long time. I worked in cardiology as an MP for 16 years. But after becoming a parent, I started looking a little differently at the food that we were eating. I always say there's a book called The Unhealthy Truth by Robin O'Brien. I'm not sure if you've ever read it. Read that book, it changed my life, and it actually made me mad. And so I started to delve a little deeper. I have a child with life-threatening food allergies. And so I started looking at the power of nutrition, or the lack thereof, and just got more interested in talking to my patients about the impact of our lifestyle choices and its impact on our health. And I found that I didn't have the kind of time to spend with my patients that I wanted to. And although my colleagues would poo-poo me a bit, they thought it was kind of cute. Oh, she loves to talk about food. I got to a point where I got really tired of writing prescriptions. And as you can imagine, after working in, traditional Western medicine for 20 years, I have great reverence and respect for my peers, but I just felt like I could make a larger impact by not writing prescriptions. And so I pivoted. I did, a few years before I transitioned, I had done a functional nutrition program, started doing a bunch of advanced trainings, got really much more passionate about food. And I always say it all starts with food. And so I woke up one morning almost 4 years ago and said to my husband, I'm done. And he was like, what are you talking about? And so I left clinical medicine, started my own practice, and, kind of fell into this female hormonal health realm, which was initially unintentional, but I believe that, God, spirituality, whoever you believe in, the universe kind of set me on a different path and motion. And so for the last 4 years, I've really worked very diligently in this space to, be a disruptor and to really, get people thinking about the fact that they need to delve a little bit deeper when they start having symptoms. You don't want to just write a prescription to band-aid a problem, and to look a little bit more significantly more profoundly at how all these lifestyle choices that we engage in really do have a significant impact on our health and our wellness. And so that's initially how it started. And from there, I started doing a lot of local TV work, and then that kind of got me down another rabbit hole of just feeling like I wanted to make a larger impact. And so it's all about impact, education, and empowerment. And I just feel like within this space, I'm able to do more than I ever did before. As much as I loved my patients and I love my colleagues, I don't miss that space anymore. I feel like I'm really doing more for people than I ever was before.
That's awesome. So we're on the Thyroid Answers podcast. So we're going to talk about thyroid physiology. And one of the big challenges that let me say this, from a disruptor standpoint, I think I'm a little bit of a disruptor as well when we're talking about thyroid physiology, because there's so much focus on the gland, so much focus on Hashimoto's. And I keep trying to get the point out, and hopefully the upcoming book will help us with that, is what's happening is going on at the cellular level. It's many times not a mistake by the cells that, hey, we're just mistakenly shut down thyroid physiology, but instead that thyroid physiology is the kind of the regulator switch. Like, hey, we want to increase metabolism, increase thyroid physiology. We're under stress, we're under danger, we want to slow down metabolism, we want to increase inflammation, deactivate thyroid hormone. I look at it more like a protective response, not like a mistake by the body. So I think I'm a little bit disruptive as well. And Dr. Erica, when we're talking about this stuff, and I think that's important because the model that we've been working under for so long is that there's no thyroid problem until the gland becomes dysfunctional and TSH goes high and T4 goes low. And what the literature says is that by the time TSH rises above lab range and T4 falls below lab range, the person has lost 95% of their gland function. 95% of the gland has been destroyed. That by the time the gland becomes, that we actually diagnose somebody with hypothyroidism, they are at the end stage, not at the beginning stage of a thyroid problem. And then our thought process is that, hey, let's just let's put more hormone in there. Why not? Let's just put more in. If it can't make it, let's just put more in. And that's like saying that, hey, if the gas, the boat is leaking, right? We'll just bail it out. We'll just keep bailing and that'll be fine. How about we fix the underlying issue and problem? And so I want to bring that in because that's the focus and that's the thought process. But for so many people, whether they get diagnosed with hypothyroidism or they are told that their thyroid physiology is fine, one of the biggest things, and whether it's because they don't feel well, they don't look, or it's a vanity thing, they don't like the way they look, people start to gain weight and then they want to lose weight. And what we've seen over the years is diet after diet. Maybe there's been about 10,000 diets that have gone on so far. We've had great shows, I say that in air quotes, called like The Biggest Loser, where we exercise people to death and starve them to death in calorie restricted diets. And then we never have a reunion show because, well,
They don't do well.
They don't do well and they come back bigger than better than ever. So we're going to talk about time restricted eating, intermittent fasting, and maybe one of the first questions that somebody's going to say is, and I'll give you two. One is, what is time restricted eating and what's intermittent fasting? What's the difference? And how are those things any different than dieting? Because I've had patients say to me, I'm sure you haven't said to you, I've already done a diet. And we're trying to say, well, this isn't a diet. This is a kind of a lifestyle way to an eating routine. And they're like, yeah, but it's still, you're restricting my calories. So can you explain the difference between those things?
Well, so I think we need to take the focus off of calories. I think that has been a huge misnomer. I think that so many people put the focus on this whole CICO, calories in, calories out, like we were talking about earlier. So what I prefer to talk about is kind of an ancestral health model. We go back to the way that our ancestors used to live. And so they didn't have refrigerators and they sure as heck didn't have a grocery store. And so they were either in a fed or a fasted state. And sometimes they had to kill and they were able to eat a large animal. And then they might go 3 or 4 days without being able to eat again. And what they probably had available to eat were probably like bark and twigs. And so, if we start thinking about the fact that over time, and really it's been the rise of the processed food industry that has largely done this to us, we went from eating 3 meals a day, probably, my mother's stage of life, and maybe I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and certainly, I have a first generation American mother. And so she, very much believed in, you got 3 meals a day and that was it, no snacks, you didn't get dessert. I mean, it just wasn't part of our mindset or methodology. And now we're in a period of time where people believe that they have to be eating all day long. They need mini meals, they need snacks, their kids need it. They can't exercise for an hour without getting a bunch of sugary garbage and Doritos and Gatorade and all that junk. And so what time restricted eating and intermittent fasting mean to me and represent, and I do believe there are distinctions. Intermittent fasting is a methodology or a strategy where you are existing either in a fed or a fasted state. There are very specific benefits from being in this fasted state. And obviously I know that we will touch on them. When I think about time restricted eating, again, a very kind of small distinction is really just saying you're either eating or you're not eating, but it's really not as focused per se on the benefits that come from that. But I do see many people in the social media space that make no distinction between either of those. In fact, I've seen lots of people trying to come up with variations in the name of intermittent fasting. And I always explain to people, listen, I don't care what you call it, but if your mindset is all about maximizing digestive rest and ensuring that you have this shortened feeding window, you are going to have benefits. And it's not about the calories. And again, it goes back to that statement I made at the very beginning that we unfortunately have gotten so calorie focused, but that's really not what intermittent fasting is about. It's all these benefits that you get when you're not eating. You don't get those when you're eating 6 mini meals a day. You don't get those when you're snacking all day long. And so we always think about things like autophagy, which is the spring cleaning of the cells. And you were talking about the impact on the mitochondria and the gut microbiome. So really, really critical. Talking about brain health. I mean, doesn't everyone that's listening want to ensure that their brain is as sharp and vital as possible? And I sometimes will say to my patients that for me, intermittent fasting, one of the things that will always keep me doing it is that I'm so sharp, like intellectually sharp. Like the last time I ate was 6 o'clock last night. And when I finish our podcast, I will go eat my lunch and I will feel amazing. And then my body will be very ready to accept some food. So, you talk about the benefits, you talk about the distinctions. It is not about calories. I think we've done a serious disservice to not just Americans, but to westernized countries by convincing people that they need to exercise more and eat less. We know that dogma doesn't work. It does not work. I mean, I have so many female patients that they will say to me, well, I only ate 1,200 calories today and then I exercised for 3 hours. I'm like, well, there's so many things wrong with that picture. So let's really talk about what we know based on research and study data is effective, and really looking at ways that we can maximize whatever your goals are. They might be all different, but certainly in the context of thyroid, most of those men and women don't want to be at their weight that they're at the present time. And they might have been missed by kind of traditional lenses that are used for Western medicine. I know for myself, and I'll just say this, I'll put this out there as an apology. When I was working in cardiology, we looked at a TSH and a free T4. And if they were normal, there's nothing wrong with your thyroid. And there's so much more to it than that. And, I always feel like I have to apologize after the fact, but you're right. It's almost like an onion. You peel a layer and you realize there's a little more that's going on. And every layer you peel back gives you hints and clues as to what might be going on.
So when we think about time restricted eating, and when I think about time restricted eating, because I do it, right,
Mm-hmm.
is that, hey, we're shrinking our eating window
Mm-hmm.
to maybe a 6, 8, 10 hours, and then we've got this long fasting period.
Mm-hmm.
When we have somebody who's doing intermittent fasting, they can fast for 5, 10, 15, 20 hours, 2 days, 1 day,
Mm-hmm.
but there isn't like a set schedule of, I mean, it could be any time period.
It's
right?
flexible, right?
Right. So it's flexible. But somebody might say to you, okay, listen, Cynthia, you're saying you're eating 2 meals per day. You're eating lunch, you're eating dinner. Okay, let's say there's 800 calories at each meal. That's 1,600 calories. Why is it more beneficial to do 1,600 calories in 2 meals than it is to break that 1,600 calories up into 3, 4, or 5 small meals per day? What sets the distinction that makes it more beneficial?
Well, I would say first is digestive rest. You're giving your body more time to break down and assimilate that food. We know that there's a positive net impact on the gut microbiome, which is responsible for so many things, including immunity. I know you were just mentioning you're fighting a cold.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's the distinction that your body is taking a longer period of time to digest that food. I mean, I know when I'm in a state where I'm not eating constantly, I'm very cognizant of what true hunger feels like. I'm very cognizant of what a full stomach is or is not feeling like. I sleep better. I have more energy. I don't want to go take a nap. How many people eat like their big Thanksgiving meal and then they want to go take a nap because they've just dropped their blood sugar and that's impacted things. So I think the distinction really comes down to the benefits that you get from being in this fasted state far outweigh anything that you would get from consuming 3 or 4 mini meals a day. And it's interesting. I have a personal friend who's a fitness pro. She's a well-regarded one. And I wanted to work with her last year. And I got to a point where, and I respect her enormously. And I said, our mindset is so different. I don't think it's beneficial for us to get spikes in insulin every time we eat. We want to limit that. So insulin is that hormone that we ingest food. We are trying to move, we're trying to lower our blood sugar. And so we're shuttling glucose that's in our bloodstream into our cells. And so if we're doing that throughout the day, that's not beneficial. And glucose and insulin are designed primarily to be fat storage hormones. So you start to, follow the curve. Why are people interested in intermittent fasting? A lot of them want to lose weight. And so I think a lot of our jobs, I'm sure that you do this quite a bit as well, is talking to people about insulin and cortisol and these hormones that, and, you know, thyroid hormone for that matter as well. They can all impact whether or not we gain or lose weight. And so why not harness strategies that we know are going to keep those levels as low as they possibly can be to be hugely beneficial to us.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, the GI tract and the gut biome is so important for appropriate blood sugar signaling. There's something called the first phase insulin response, and it's all set up by what's going on in the GI tract. And if you lose your first phase insulin response, that's the earliest sign that you have a blood sugar problem. But I think to go back and for the listener to think about, I think one of the things, and I think you were starting to go down that track, so I'm going to finish that thought, I think, is that when you eat like 200 or 300 calories and you eat lots of small little meals, one of the challenges that occurs is that you're never really getting sufficient satiety signals to the brain. And the brain is saying, if you do that once or twice, 1 day, 2 days in a row, it's not a real big deal. But if your brain is constantly getting signals of not reaching satiety, then that becomes a danger response, right? The body's in the cells, the cell intelligence is saying, hey, we're in starvation mode. And so if we're never getting enough food and for weeks on end, we're eating calorie restricted meal after meal after meal, not reaching satiety signals in the brain, then one of the things that happens is the brain says, hey, we need to slow down metabolism because there's not enough food coming in. It's a danger signal. And so for the person who's doing that calorie restricted diet for weeks on end, and they're like, hey, I lost some weight, but now I gained it all back. What happened? You slow down your metabolism because your brain was getting the signal like, hey, we never have quite enough food coming in here. And when somebody's doing time restricted eating or intermittent fasting, you may be eating the same calorie content, but they're getting signals of satiety to the brain many times because they're getting enough food in one meal or two meals. And you've seen this too, I'm sure. There are some patients, I got a gentleman right now, he's thriving on one meal per day and losing weight like crazy, but has more energy, his libido's back, everything's great, and he's eating less calories. Why is it working? Well, because his brain's getting the signal of satiety. And when the brain gets that signal of satiety, then there isn't this danger signal and, hey, we need to slow down metabolism. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's a really good distinction, and one that I know your listeners, a big key takeaway. We cannot lose weight if we are not satiated. That is really, really critical. And I agree with you 100%. I know, I probably will break my fast. I'll give you an example. People always ask me this. I love eggs and I love bacon and I love avocado. And so depending on whether or not it's a higher carb versus a lower carb day, I adjust my portions. But you must ensure you're getting enough healthy fats in your meals. And it's not that you have to be ketogenic, because I'm not, but fat is one of those things that keeps us satiated. It lights up our taste buds. It makes us happy. It helps support hormonal synthesis. So many key mechanisms in the body. And I think that, unfortunately, with these mini meals and these frequent meals, you really drive home that point beautifully, that you're never satisfied. And if you were to eat enough calories in that meal, that would, impact your brain in a different level. And so I see so many people that are getting so much freedom from these shorter, more frequent meals. And so, it's the way that our bodies are designed to eat. That's, you go back to that ancestral health perspective. And, my co-author and I actually wrote a small book on this earlier this year. And it's one of the things, the more I understood about Paleolithic, and I hate to use paleo as an example, but ancestral health perspectives, they're like, oh, well, that's how our bodies are designed to thrive. And so people that ascribe to that philosophy, that are, having these longer periods of fasting, they look very different than their conventional kind of diseased standard American diet peers. And a lot of it's inflammation, but a lot of it's also the fact that they're not overwhelming their body with calories that are nutriently depleted or non-existent, and they're not eating these highly excitatory, excitotoxic type meals that are kind of standard in the standard American diet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest challenge is just look at what the guidelines were, this 90s, what were we telling everybody? You need to eat 5 to 6 small meals per day,
Ugh.
like every 2 hours to manage your blood sugar. And I was taught that.
Yeah,
I
so fun.
feel the same thing. And you look at the people that do that and what happened to them. We had an obesity epidemic. We had a cardiovascular epidemic. We've had Alzheimer's epidemic. We've had all these inflammatory conditions as a result of this great advice that we were all told was the way to do it, right?
Yeah.
And now, and then you take a look at somebody who's doing time restricted eating, intermittent fasting, eating better quality food less frequently, eating less volume, and somehow the person who is not following the, you know, blood sugar regulation guidelines,
Yeah.
right, is
Yeah.
doing so much better and looks healthier
Right.
than the person who's following these guidelines. And I don't know, it seemed right on paper, right? It seemed
No,
right
I
when,
mean, and we were all schooled that way. And that was, I did a talk earlier this year and I kind of dispelled three of the big tenets of nutrition that I was taught when I was going through my training. And I went to a big research institution, and I'd like to point out to people that part of evolving as a human being is questioning. Like, I was trained to question. I am not a sheep. And so standing in the kind of mindset of what I was trained in, I'm like, darn, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so let me look a little bit deeper. So I think it's really, really critical and so important that we're getting that message out there. I always say, don't blame sugar, or excuse me, don't blame fat for what sugar did. And so what happened, this bastardization of fats for so many years. I still have women that are paranoid to eat healthy fats because they've been conditioned to believe they want no fat, no low fat or non-fat. And I just remind them, if they take the fat out, what do you think they add?
yeah.
You
And
know?
if you look at most of the research that papers, and they talk about high fat diet, they're not high fat diet like we're talking high fat, like we would consider high fat, healthy, high fat diet, higher fat diet. Their high fat diet is this processed junk food type diet. And they're saying, hey, look, the high fat diet doesn't work. It makes people sick. It makes well, wait a minute. We're talking about two different things.
Right.
And so we have this big name, but it really, you can bastardize that to be one thing, or you can have it be something else. And I think that's the problem. People aren't really understanding that we're not doing a good enough job helping people understand that there's good healthy fats and there's some really terrible fats that people are putting out there. And just sometimes the way we cook things takes a good fat and converts it
It oxidizes it.
into a problem.
Absolutely. We always have ongoing wars on social media about seed oils, and that's one of the things I was just on vacation with my family, and my standard, I was at a very nice resort and I just wanted a burger. And so I said, I want a naked burger. And of course they kept pushing the fries. And so I knew what the answer was, but I wanted the guy to say it. And I said, so what do they fry the fries in? He's like, vegetable oil. I said, no, thank you. And he's like, what's wrong with that? And so I took it as an opportunity to talk to him about what that does. But the unfortunate thing, and I'm sure you and your family probably find this to be the case as well, when you're traveling, when you're outside your realm and you're being exposed to super inflammatory things like vegetable oils, inferior fats, you come home and you're like, why do I feel so puffy and bloated? It's not because I drank too much. It's not because I ate too many sweets. Empirically, everything feels like it's, within that paradigm that we want to work within. But you come to find out that you get exposed to it all over the place in restaurants, unfortunately.
And it is unfortunate. And I just had this conversation with a patient yesterday who said, well, she's struggling with health issues and we're seeing those changes in her labs and her symptoms, but she's like, well, it's crazy to try and have to eat healthy because I like to eat out and it's, what am I going to do? I'm like, listen, you have to make a decision, picking the place. You may not have the best option to pick all the time, but eat the best food you can. Yeah. But this is one of the reasons why we have a health crisis in this country, is because we rely on somebody else so often to cook our meals and thinking that they're going to cook us this great healthy meal, when in reality, very few places are really focused on the quality of the food and what we're cooking with and how we're cooking it. More people are focused on, let's just make it look good, taste good, but it doesn't have to be necessarily a healthy meal.
Correct. And it's really unfortunate. The only city that I've been to recently that I think has a huge focus, and I have to applaud Austin, Texas. They do a phenomenal job. I mean, I was totally geeking out. I was like in nutrition nerd heaven, that I was sitting in a restaurant and they only used avocado oil or coconut oil. They had Siete brand tortillas. They were very, that we have no soy, we have no vegetable oils. I mean, I was completely nerded out and I felt so happy and I came home feeling great. So, unfortunately, food manufacturers have convinced, restaurateurs, they've convinced us to spend the least amount of money on a lot of food sources. And so that explains why restaurants, they just want what's the least expensive option. They're not going to pick the really healthy stuff. So,
Absolutely. So let's get into some meat and potatoes, right?
Mhm.
If somebody wants to get started, time restricted eating, intermittent fasting, how do you get somebody started? What's the process that they should go through? And then we'll talk about like what are the things in the first few couple weeks that they really may have some struggles with.
Mhm. Well, I think it's really important to screen men or women to see if they're appropriate. There are people in particular that I have to kind of handhold if they have problems with blood sugar dysregulation, if they're reactive hypoglycemic, meaning they tend to run with low blood sugars. And sometimes that can be kind of the first sign that their insulin mechanisms are not working quite as efficiently. So I think screening is important. Do they have a history of eating disorders? I see a lot of people that, kind of fall into my lap that use intermittent fasting as a way to hide their anorexia. But after the screening process, I usually suggest if they're really new to this, that we start with a 12-hour fasting window and we slowly open that window up. I always say, let's make sure you do 12 hours, and anyone can do that. Let's make sure you can hit that 12 hours and we'll slowly open it up. And ideally, I like them to get to a 16-hour window, but that may take a month, and that's totally okay. Some people are not ready to do that 7 days a week. So I will suggest let's do it 3 days a week. It's all about meeting our patients where they are and not demanding that they be rigid, because that is the beauty of intermittent fasting, is that it is flexible. So we always start with the fasting window and then determining, do they want to have one meal in their fasting window? Do they want to have two? I find most people really genuinely want to eat twice. And, many people will ask, well, how do I know that I've gotten it right in terms of my portions of protein, fat, and carbohydrates? Because I do not suggest calorie counting as a rule. I'm just not a fan of that. And so I would say, if you are hungry for a second meal, then if you're doing 2 meals a day, that's perfect. If you have one meal and then you're not hungry again until the following morning, maybe you want to ascribe to the one meal a day. So we start with figuring out what works best for them and their lifestyle, deciding the frequency and then the duration of that fast. Now, in terms of troubleshooting, sometimes it doesn't happen all that often, but I do have people who don't have more energy when they're fasted. They really struggle. If it's taking them a week or two and they're still feeling like they're dragging every morning, that may be a sign it's not the right strategy. Some people have a lack of awareness if their blood sugar is low. So we'll pull out a glucometer so they can check, like if you're getting sweaty and you're really tired, let's make sure it's not a blood sugar issue. Other people just don't like not eating multiple meals a day. And so that mindset shift is important. Limiting beliefs are important. So making sure that they're ready to make those changes. The other thing that I think is a good barometer for whether or not intermittent fasting is working is, are you sleeping well? You should be sleeping well. And well means you don't wake up at night every night. Now, if you have alcohol, if you are under, if your macros aren't proper, meaning you're too low carb, maybe you didn't get enough healthy fats in your meals and you're waking up because you're hungry or your blood sugar drops, that's another issue. So there's a lot of troubleshooting that goes on, but I would say 90% of my patients are like duck to water. It's really more the mindset piece for them. And I feel like it takes probably a solid 3 to 4 weeks to really get it ingrained into their lifestyle. But in terms of looking at benefits, I always tell people to be patient. Unfortunately, we have what do they call it? The fast food mentality. We want everything now. So reminding them that you didn't gain 15 pounds overnight. You're not going to lose it overnight. Asking them to commit to a 60-day period of time to try it. And then we reevaluate, because there are definitely people that will not lose weight at 60 days. And then we have to look a little more deeply at what else might be contributing to the degree of inflammation they're experiencing.
Yeah. So, and I'd say my tactic is pretty much the same. Take them from how many meals a day eating. Let's start incrementally moving, shifting that back a half an hour. Do you prefer breakfast and lunch? Do you prefer a lunch and dinner? But let's shrink it one way or the other. But definitely for the listeners, if you're getting shaky, lightheaded, hangry, You got to eat because low blood sugar is just as bad as bad blood
Yeah,
sugar.
it
You're
really
not
is.
getting fuel to your brain. But once you do get it geared in, then the key thing is that your body, the beauty of it, and I'll let you talk to this a little bit, because somebody might say, well, if I'm not eating, what is my body using for energy? How am I going to get energy? No wonder I'm tired because I don't have any food in my system.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, to help somebody understand what's happening during that intermittent fasting that's allowing them to go 6, 12, 18 hours without food, how can they continue to thrive? Can you explain
Yeah.
that?
So it's that shift, when we talk about the sugar burners who get hangry, who, need to eat frequently, who get sweaty, that's a very important distinction from those that become fat adapted. They're using fat, they're tapping into fat stores, fat oxidation to actually fuel their body. These are the people that can go to the gym and bang out a hard workout like I do, almost every day. And I can do that in a completely fasted state. And so part of the distinction between those two type of philosophies is that those that are fat adapted, so you get to a point where your body is really tapping into fat stores for for fuel, is that you have brain clarity, you've got lots of energy, you're not hungry. Like my stomach may growl if I'm at the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning, but I'm not hungry. I can distinguish for myself what is really going on. And so I think it's that freedom. I think for a lot of people, they're like, oh, this is great. I don't have to worry if I get on a plane and they don't have food I can eat, or if I get to an airport and there's crap to eat in the airport. I know that I can power through that additional time frame. So it's really that distinction about talking about what fuel your body is using as its primary fuel source. And this is such a shift from, I'm sure the way that you were schooled as well as I was, about, oh, we want carbs, we need lots of carbs for energy. And I remind people, I'm like, no, really, irrespective of what nutritional philosophy you abide by, minus the standard American diet, we really want to use fat as that fuel source because it's efficient, it'll give us sustained energy, it will give us mental clarity, all of those things that are really, really critical. And for anyone that's listening, that may not happen overnight. It may be that you have to do intermittent fasting with a shorter fasting window for a period of time. You may have to use some strategies to try to bolster up, transitioning from a sugar to, a fat burner. But it's not something that's insurmountable. Some of my ladies, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for us to get to a point where they're ready to be able to do that. And what it really represents is when you break your fast, you're always having some type of a healthy fat. I mean, that's really critical. Healthy fats and protein, and then add in your carbs if you earned them, as I always say. And certainly with your thyroid focus, I'm not a proponent of sustained low carbs. I think it can be really hard for conversion of proper thyroid hormone conversion if you're not getting enough healthy carbohydrates. I'm not sure how you feel about that as well. I'm sure I probably know, but
Yeah, I think there's got to be a balance there.
Mhm.
And I think one of those things, just to kind of finish off the last comment, when we're talking about what's your body using, your body is not going to burn off fat reserves, right? If you've got a belly, butt, boobs, or if you're a dude with moves, or you got your own muffin top, right? Then you have extra resources on board.
Mhm.
And so there's no reason to tap into those extra resources if you're constantly bringing things in. And so it's like when you do this time restricted eating, when you do this intermittent fasting, what happens is you definitely tap into, as Cynthia was saying, you definitely start tapping into those reserves. But there's no reason for your body to say, I'm going to tap into the reserves and go through the energy and effort to break down fat stores if I've got immediate glucose and food coming right into the system. Why would I ever break down fat? So if you're wondering, like, how are you going to have energy? Your body has it. It's around your waist. It's around your butt. There is excess energy in your body. It's just in storage form. But it takes a lot of work to get that out of storage form.
It
And your
does.
body's not going to go through that extra effort if you're constantly bringing things in, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the key, that intermittent fasting, once you kind of get it geared in and your body starts to be able to adapt, then your body is able to start pulling off those fat reserves. And why can you not be hungry for hours on end? That's the other question people has. How come I'm never hungry? I'm doing this. I'm only eating 2 meals per day. I'm never hungry. Why am I never hungry? And I was explaining it like, starting a fire with newspaper or maintaining that fire with logs, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to burn that fire and keep your house fire going with newspaper, you're going to be throwing paper on there all day. Every couple of minutes you're throwing paper on there. You're going to need a ton of resources. You're going to be calling all your friends to bring bundles of newspaper. You're going to have bundles all over the house. And that's like the fat in your body. You just keep stacking it everywhere because you know you're going to need it. But if you're going to burn if your body can burn fat, that's like taking a big log and throwing it on the fireplace. You can walk away for hours because your body can burn that more efficiently. Mm-hmm. So if you can get yourself to time restricted eating and you can do this on a consistent basis, you will not be as hungry and you'll be able to go for longer and longer periods of time without that constant hunger signal.
And that freedom, I think, is really an important distinction. I truly believe that once people are, we use the term fat adapted, it is wonderful. I mean, it really, really is. I think it scares people initially. I know that I certainly felt that way probably 5 years ago, but now that I embrace that whole philosophy, I mean, it's just so easy. It really is.
Yeah, especially for the people who don't I don't know what to cook. I have 3 meals a day. I hate cooking. Look, if you do time restricted eating, you don't really have to think that hard.
Yeah.
You could cook on Sunday and you have meals for the week because you may only be eating 1 or 2 meals in a day, and it makes life easier. You're also not in crisis mode every 2 to 3 hours, like, oh, we got to stop and get something to eat, where we're going to eat. And it's that being stressful because you're like, I can go 12, 14, 16, 18 hours, not a big deal. And so I don't have to eat. It may be a habit. I may want to stop and get a break, but you don't have to because your body is able to burn off the stores. And that's really what we all want.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. When somebody is doing intermittent fasting, time restricted eating, and they're going down this process, we don't want them counting calories. We had that discussion before, and just so we say it for everybody, calories in, calories out. Calories have some importance, but they are not the thing. If you could just lose weight by eating less calories and exercising more and creating that calorie deficit, if that worked and you could cut out 500 calories a day, in 2.5 years, you'd be gone. There would be nothing left of you if that's how simple it was, because your body would burn through everything. And we all know that you hit a plateau point and then you start gaining weight. Mm-hmm. So that part being said, we're not going to use calories as our indicator. What would you suggest for people, just for the layperson, what indicators would you have them looking at so they can understand, is this having an impact? Because you and I both know when people do this, many times they're doing it for weight, and their weight may not change right away. Mm-hmm. So what indicators would you tell people to take a look at to know that even though they're not losing weight, that they are getting better?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I talk about is mental clarity. The insulin levels being low. How productive do you feel like your mornings are now? And 99.9% of the time, like, oh my gosh, I have so much energy, I don't know what to do with it. They start sleeping better. All of a sudden, their constipation, diarrhea issues have worked themselves out. I find people have less bloating. So I always say use the non-scale victories, because I think we're so focused as a society. I don't even have a scale in my house. I don't think it's helpful. The only time I get weighed is when I go for a doctor's appointment, which I thankfully don't have very often. So sleep, energy, mental clarity, we look at productivity. I always say the non-scale victories, how are you feeling? What are your symptoms that you started with? And I find that the digestive symptoms improve enormously. They're like, oh, well, because I'm not eating for 16 hours out of the day, all my bloating's gone. All of a sudden, my clothes feel a little bit less tight. All of a sudden, I don't feel quite so puffy. All of a sudden, I no longer have constipation, because we're assuming that, as we're kind of walking our patients through this process, we're talking about nutrient dense foods. So maybe they're eating a few more vegetables, and maybe that's what their body needed, was a little bit of a higher fiber in their diet to kind of get things moving along. And they're drinking more water because they're, during this fasted state, they're kind of limited in terms of options they can do. And obviously they're not going to be drinking, coffee and tea into the evening if they want to have a restful night's sleep. So those are the non-scale victories that I tend to hear with greater frequency. And I use them as victories. I really do. I try to get people off of being focused primarily on weight loss as the number one reason why they need to do this. And then the weight loss will eventually come, without a doubt.
Yeah, I think what we hear in allopathic medicine, and I came from that world, so I'm not bashing it, but when somebody's overweight, we say, hey, if you lose weight, you'll be healthier. And my answer to that is the reason you're overweight is because you're unhealthy. And so you have to fix your health first, then the weight will come off. We have it backwards in most cases. Most people are thinking, if I lose the weight, then I'll be healthy. No, you have to be healthy to be able to burn the fat off. And so if you're listening to this, we're not putting focus on calories. We're not putting focus on weight. We're saying just do the right things. If you do the right things first, then the good things will happen, but they may take a little bit of time to occur. And go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, I love that distinction. And I always go back to, it didn't take you one day or 1 month to gain 15 pounds. You are not going to lose it in 1 day or 1 week or 1 month. So looking at it as, these are all simple steps you're putting in the right direction. You mentioned, you have to get healthy first. As you start making better changes, more healthful changes, it'll be much easier for your body to say, hey, I'm running more optimally. So now I can release some of this weight that I'm hanging on to, or whatever other issues people are really struggling with, joint pain, brain fog, poor sleep, no libido. Libido in the toilet is a huge one.
Yeah. And it's important to understand is your body's storing fat, right? Because it's in danger mode. It's saying, hey, I'm going to store these extra resources in case I need them later. But then your adipose tissue, especially the white adipose tissue, becomes one of your dominant inflammatory organs in the body, driving out hormones, driving out inflammatory chemicals. And it's creating, you want to know why you have pain? Because your fat cells are just dumping out these inflammatory cytokines, or what we call adipokines, out into the system, and that's triggering problems. It will be one of those factors that slows down your thyroid physiology. The other things you can look at, and I'm not big on having my patients measure too much stuff, but I think HRV is a great tool. If you have an Apple Watch, or you have an Oura Ring, or you have a BioBand, it's in there. It's already in there. Most people buy an Apple Watch, they have no idea what HRV is. And in the background, they've got one of the best tools. It's not perfect, but it is one of the better tools you can measure. And HRV, if you're doing your intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating, what you want to watch is for your HRV to start to slowly and steadily start to rise over time. That'll help you understand that, hey, I'm on the right track. HRV is a great tool. And I'll give you an explanation. My HRV is usually 60s, 70s. My HRV with this scratchy throat this morning and the last 2 days has been in the 40s. So it means that, hey, my body is struggling a bit to heal and recover. I chose not to exercise the first day. I chose not to. I usually exercise anyway, but I took the day off because I'm like, hey, I got to take it easy, just get myself to recover. But HRV can be that tool that either tells you that, hey, I'm trending up, so this is probably good for me, or I'm trending down, something's going on with my health. Something's on its way, and that it should be, if we listen, and sometimes I don't, that, hey, things are good, aren't going on well right now. I need to find out what those stressors are. I need to reduce my stress. I need to get more sleep. I need to chill out, maybe meditate a little bit more, or chill on the exercise if you're over exercising, and just say, hey, I got to take it a little bit easier. But people can look at their fasting blood sugar. You can look at your ketones. You can do all that stuff, but all that stuff is more work. Right. I would tell you, and Cynthia, you can tell me if it's different, just focus on the easy stuff. Like,
keep it simple.
Yeah, keep it super, super simple. How do I feel? Do I have more energy? Do I sleep better? Is my libido better? Is my mood better? Am I less gassy, less bloated? Just look at all that list of symptoms that you have and understand that the list of symptoms you have are not the disorder, right? Those are the signs that there's a problem. So those aren't meant to be masked with supplements or medications. They're meant to be looked at and say, okay, now why this is telling me something's not wrong with the body, but it's also the indicator to tell you when things are good, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Use it as a barometer. I mean, I think, having apps is super convenient, but I agree with you that I am a huge fan of just keeping things simple. Like I track I'll give you an example. I track my workouts and I track how I feel, and I do all of that. But beyond that, I don't want to be peeing on strips. I don't want to be sticking my finger. I try to keep things as simple as possible. And I agree with you that, we're a technology fueled environment that we live in, but it's all the things that are non-tech. Like I always say, when it gets dark outside, I put my blue blockers on as an example. And I'm telling my body it's time to go to bed, even though there are lights on in my house. And, I don't live in an aquarium. Someone was telling me the other day, they're like, oh, you should just have red lights on in your house. I said, well, that's not realistic. I've got teenagers at home, they have to get homework done. But the point being, I think for all the beneficial tech that we have in our environment, there's some stuff that's really great if it's low tech. And so, checking in with yourself, having that connection with your body, having that discussion, internally or externally with yourself about how do you feel is really critical.
So if we're going to talk about people, hyperthyroidism, there's this discussion out there that you can't do time restricted eating or intermittent fasting if you have a hypothyroid condition, because it'll make that hypothyroid condition worse. What say you?
Well, for full admission here, I have non-Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. They suspect that my thyroid is underactive initially because I had high mercury levels in my body, which didn't rectify itself despite, I've jumped through every hoop. So I want to be upfront about that. I've been on Nature Thyroid for about 3 years. So it came after, and it had nothing to do with me doing intermittent fasting. But the point being, I am able to successfully navigate intermittent fasting and have subclinical hypothyroidism. The point of why I'm sharing this is if you have stable thyroid issues, stable, meaning you're not actively, your antibodies haven't suddenly gone through the roof, you're not sick, you feel good, you're sleeping well, you have a libido, you have lots of energy. There's no to me, in my clinical opinion, there's no issue with attempting to engage with intermittent fasting. It's when people are active, like if their Hosh is suddenly flared and they're sick and they don't feel good and they're really pushing their body. That's when I would say I don't like to see people doing intermittent fasting. But I think for someone that's stable on medication, feels good, is doing well, has a fairly stable weight, I think there's no reason not to engage, or at least try it. I always say you can always try it. If you decide you don't like it, it doesn't work for you, then that's fine. But I think there's danger in creating blanket statements. I'm not sure how you feel, but when we're talking about stable thyroid function, even people that are being medicated for stable thyroid, for either under or overactive, as long as it's in a kind of chronic state and not in an acute state, I think it's fine to try it.
Yeah. So I would say this is that as a person with Hashimoto's, I've been time restricted intermittent fasting for years, and it's a non-issue for me. It's actually more functional. From a sciencey standpoint, I can give a lot of reasons why it can still be beneficial, and we won't go deep into the woods, but we do look at things like we see a lot of people who have, especially when we're talking about eating frequent meals, they can have as you start to put on more body fat, that body fat releases something called leptin. Leptin is a signal that goes to your brain that says, hey, shut down the physiology and increase your thyroid metabolism because we're storing fat. The problem is if you continue to eat those small frequent meals, you continue to store fat, you continue to produce leptin, you become leptin resistant, and then you do not get the signal to increase your thyroid hormone and physiology. So from a science standpoint, depending where somebody's at, especially if they're in leptin resistance, then absolutely a time restricted eating could be beneficial because now we get a chance to not store as much fat. We have less leptin floating around in the system and we can get better thyroid signaling. So we won't get into goody related proteins and all those things. But the other thing that can be really important too is that and this is where I think people get confused, if you have less calories in, then that can make your hypothyroid state a little bit worse at the cellular level, not necessarily the gland level, but the cellular level. And the answer for that is it might be, but one of the big things that occurs in somebody who's got what I call cellular hypothyroidism, their thyroid hormones being deactivated, there's some type of threat response. And when that kicks in, your thyroid hormone does downplay cellular metabolism, decreases mitochondrial function, decreases mitochondria, the number of mitochondria, so you can't burn as much fuel. That is on purpose. Things go into storage. The other issue is that when you have that cellular hypothyroidism occurring, there's two things that are occurring at the cell that are really important. One is it triggers the inflammatory cascade to help you go kill whatever that threat is. And two, it helps actually activate autophagy, which is this self-eating. And so what autophagy is for the listeners is if there's cell stress, cell danger, there's a bacteria, there's a virus, there's a toxin in the cell will try and protect itself and then close off the cell essentially and start kind of cleaning up the inside of the cell to try and find it. You need thyroid hormone and the thyroid hormone signaling to do that. And when you have some of this deactivation of thyroid hormone going on in the cell, it allows for autophagy. So we always talk about low thyroid or hypothyroid being a problem. Hypothyroidism at the cell, increasing thyroid activation or decreasing thyroid activation turns on and turns off. So sometimes when T3 binds, it turns on things. And sometimes when there's not enough T3 to bind to things, it turns on things. And autophagy is one of the best things to clean up the debris and the stuff that's going on inside the cell. So for that reason, I again think that this can be a really good thing for somebody who's got thyroid issues going on.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you say that because I actually got into a interesting discussion about thyroid and intermittent fasting on social media. And I finally just shut the discussion down, but I kept saying, if it makes you feel any better, I have hypothyroidism. And I said, I do well. I said, I am a very, very healthy individual, but I recognize it's not for everybody. So it's always going back to bioindividuality. And we look at the science and we can look that it ultimately comes down to how does someone's body respond to that? But there are so many benefits to intermittent fasting that I think most of us that are dealing with, whether it's autoimmune or non-autoimmune, it is worth a try. I think that's what I hear is the big takeaway. We look at the data, we look at the science, we look at, what people are, really doing in real life, IRL. That's what my kids always say, IRL. I'm like, what? In real life, what really works for people.
Yeah, and it's important for people to understand that from person to person, there's a lot of variety, but really when it comes down to eating, the time restricted eating, the intermittent fasting, this makes more sense than somebody needing or requiring food every 2 hours. Just from a survival standpoint, we are meant to be able to go for longer periods of time. If we had to eat every 2 hours, we would never have gotten this far in life. There's no way.
Yeah, absolutely. It would have died off long ago.
I know we're getting to the end of our time, but I do want to find out, what would be maybe 3 or 4 tips if somebody wants to get into intermittent fasting or time restricted eating? What would be 3 or 4 tips that you would recommend for them?
Okay, so first, give yourself grace because a lot of people are so hard. It's this all or nothing mentality, and I'm like, listen. Find what works for you and your lifestyle. That may be different than your best friend, it may be different than your spouse. So first determine what is realistic for you to do. So sit down and decide for yourself, is it going to be that you're going to do this 7 days a week or you're going to do it a couple days a week to decide. You need to pick your fasting window first and start with 12 hours if you're concerned. Slowly increase that by an hour every couple of days if you're tolerating. If you're not, stop it where you are. If you get to 14 hours, that's great. That's better than 12 hours. I mean, I always say, always look at your small victories. I would say, secondly, ensure that the food that you're consuming during your feeding window is high quality. And that is different for everyone, right? But I always say focus on protein and healthy fats first, and then add in your carbohydrates. Now, for those of us that have thyroid issues, I'm not a fan of people doing sustained low carb all the time. So it may be that on a day where you're lifting heavy or more physically active, you're going to have sweet potato or squash or whatever it is that you desire. I myself am gluten, grains, and dairy free as well as oxalates, so I don't expect anyone to ascribe to that philosophy. Third, I want to make sure that you use things like sleep quality as a barometer for how well your body is responding. So I talk a lot about sleep as being foundational to your health. 7-8 hours, cold, dark room, off electronics, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're sleeping a solid 7-8 hours, you wake up refreshed, then that's validation that you're on the right path. And then lastly, be open to the fact that not every single person who does intermittent fasting does it every day. There are so many variations, but I always suggest starting with like a 16-8 as a starter. And then from there, decide, do you want to do one meal a day? Do you want to do a 5-1-1, which is a more advanced strategy? Do you just want to do intermittent fasting Monday through Friday? And just honoring what makes the most sense and not being rigid. Like that is the one thing about intermittent fasting that I think is so critical, is that it's flexible. And so that means you don't need to be rigid, and giving yourself grace. And yes, you can do intermittent fasting on vacation and with different time zones. I do it with some frequency. So don't let that scare you off. And then lastly, which I know this is technically 5, but really spend some time surrounding yourself with people that are going to be supportive of that decision. I find that a lot of men and women get undermined because the people that are around them are not yet ready to make those kinds of changes. Therefore, they will undermine them, cause them to doubt themselves. And let me reassure you that I've been doing intermittent fasting for almost 5 years. It took my husband about 3 years to wrap his head around making that change, but now he's completely on board. And so I just encourage you to surround yourself with positive, affirming people that can serve as resources or examples. And certainly, obviously, your podcast is one of them, but just making sure that you are surrounded by the support that you need through this endeavor.
Hey, I think those are all great tips. And I think, to add to that is what this type of eating style should give you is freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom
Absolutely.
and metabolic flexibility so that you're not always in a panic. What am I going to eat? I have to eat now. I got to do this. It should give you metabolic flexibility. If you want to eat sugars, you can eat sugars and your body will be able to adapt to it. You want to eat fats, your body's going to be able to take those fats and be able to utilize them. If you don't have anything to eat, your body's going to figure out how to do it without having you go through a whole bunch of symptoms. So what it does is allow freedom. You're not always worried about meals. It actually is that you're eating better quality food, less of it. You're actually going to save more money in time. It's healthier for you. And it allows you metabolic flexibility. You want to splurge, and your body should be able to handle it better. You want to be able to have 3 meals one day and you want to go out and have a big breakfast, fantastic. But you want to get into a routine, and whether, as Cynthia said, whether it's you do it every day, I would probably 5-6 days a week. I time restrict eat. Sometimes it's 1 meal a day, sometimes it's 2 meals a day. And then when I'm home with my wife and, we're flexible. Whatever we want to do that day is what we do. And we don't let this become the next stressor in our life that's causing our health to decline, right?
Rigidity is no good.
Absolutely. So to finish up, where can people get more information about you? Can you point them to the TED Talk? Can you tell them where you're found at, Instagram, all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah. So first and foremost, my website, I've got lots of free resources, even ones on intermittent fasting. It's www.cynthiathurlow.com. I did a little bit of a TED Talk. I've done 2, but my biggest one is one on intermittent fasting transformational technique that's on YouTube that I think is at 4.1 million views and counting. And that's only been out since May. You can find me on Instagram, Cynthia Thurlow, as well as Twitter and Facebook. Would love to interact with you there. I also have a free Facebook group on, it's called Cynthia's Circle for lack of a better name. We couldn't come up with a better name, but I exist on all those platforms and would love, love, love to have your listeners check things out.
Awesome. And you have a podcast as well?
I do. It's called Everyday Wellness. How could I forget that? I co-host that with a clinical psychologist, and we talk about a variety of health and wellness topics. Lately, it's been very kind of keto disruptor focused. We've had some really interesting people on as of late. Lots of great feedback, and we'd love to have your listeners check us out there too.
Excellent. So I want to thank you so much for coming on. I still had a bunch of questions to go, but but
maybe we'll do round 2 in 2020.
Yeah, we'll maybe try and do that. So thank you so much for coming on. And Dr. Erica mixed a good one, but she can listen to it as well. All right?
Sounds great.
Care.